The White Mountains of New Hampshire are defined by a specific, unforgiving geography. In the winter months, the Presidential Range becomes an alpine environment that mirrors the conditions of the Arctic Circle. The Presidential Range is not merely a collection of peaks, it is a funnel for weather systems moving across the North American continent. Winds here regularly exceed hurricane force, and temperatures often drop well below zero, creating a landscape of stunted trees known as crumholes and vast, wind-swept snowfields. In February, the Great Gulf Wilderness is silent. It is a glacial cirque, a deep, bowl-shaped valley carved into the earth between Mount Washington, Mount Jefferson, and Mount Adams. The terrain is a vertical labyrinth of dense spruce and fir, buried under several feet of packed snow and fresh powder. At this time of year, the distinction between the sky and the ground often vanishes. A phenomenon known as a whiteout can occur in seconds, stripping away all sense of depth, direction, and horizon. The air in the Great Gulf is thin and dry. Sound does not travel far. It is swallowed by the density of the forest and the sheer scale of the granite walls rising on three sides. There is no ambient noise from the valleys below. The only movement is the rhythmic shifting of snow drifts and the occasional fracture of an ice-laden branch. It is a place of absolute isolation, where the environment exists in a state of permanent, cold indifference to anything that enters it. Jennifer Figg was not a casual visitor to the wilderness. At 35 years old, she possessed a physical and mental constitution shaped by a lifetime of rigorous athletic pursuit. She was a marathon runner and a triathlete, accustomed to the specific demands of long-distance endurance. This background provided her with more than just cardiovascular strength. It gave her an intimate understanding of her own physiological limits and the necessity of pacing. She knew how the human body responded to exhaustion, how it burned fuel, and how the mind begins to negotiate with pain when the finish line is not yet in sight. Her decision to ski the Great Gulf on February 19, 1989, was not an act of recklessness, but rather a pursuit of a familiar challenge. She was an experienced cross-country skier, well-versed in the mechanics of movement across frozen terrain. The Great Gulf is one of the most rugged areas in the White Mountains, a place where the trails are often obscured by drifts and the incline requires constant vigilance. Figg was equipped for a day trip, a strenuous excursion that would test her muscles and her technique. She carried a small pack, minimal supplies, and the confidence of someone who had navigated difficult environments many times before. Her motivation was rooted in the quiet discipline of the sport. Cross-country skiing in the Presidential Range is a solitary endeavor that requires a rhythmic, meditative focus. It is a process of managing breath and momentum. Figg understood the geography of the region, but she also understood the internal geography of survival. The importance of remaining calm when the heart rate spikes and the ability to make logical decisions under physical duress. These traits were not merely hobbies, they were foundational aspects of her character. On that Sunday morning, the weather forecast was typical for a New Hampshire winter, cold, but manageable for a seasoned athlete. She set out with the intention of completing a loop, a journey that would take her through the deep basin of the Gulf and back to the safety of the trailhead. She was wearing layers of synthetic clothing designed to wick moisture away from her skin, a critical defense against hypothermia. However, in the White Mountains, gear is only as effective as the environment allows it to be. The transition from a controlled athletic pursuit to a survival situation is often subtle. It begins with a slight deviation in the path or a marginal change in the wind. For Figg, the transition was marked by the onset of a sudden, aggressive storm system that moved over the ridge of Mount Washington with unexpected speed. The temperature began to plummet, and the visibility, which had been clear enough to see the surrounding peaks, started to contract. The wind, channeled through the narrow gap of the Gulf, began to erase the tracks she had just made. The familiar landmarks, the specific lean of a tree, the shape of a rock outcropping, dissolved into a uniform gray. The boundary between the athlete and the survivor began to blur as the reality of the mountain asserted itself over the schedule of the skier. The point of no return arrived on the afternoon of Sunday, February 19th. As Jennifer Figg attempted to navigate the steep, wooded terrain of the Great Gulf, the atmospheric conditions shifted from a standard winter chill to a blinding blizzard. The wind accelerated, gusting over 50 miles per hour, which instantly whipped the loose powder into a dense, opaque screen. This is the whiteout, a state where the human eye loses its ability to distinguish distance or slope. During a descent, Figg suffered a fall. The mechanics of the accident were simple, a caught ski or an unseen dip in the snow, but the consequence was immediate. One of her skis snapped. In the deep, unpacked snow of the Great Gulf, a broken ski is a catastrophic equipment failure. Without the surface area to stay atop the drifts, a person sinks waist-deep into the powder, a physical state known as post-holing. Movement becomes an exhausting, calorie-intensive struggle that quickly leads to hypothermia. Fig attempted to hike out, but the geography of the Gulf is a natural trap. The basin is surrounded by near-vertical walls. In the disorientation of the storm, she lost the trail markers. Every direction looked identical. The tracks she had made minutes prior were filled in by the wind before she could backtrace them. She was no longer a skier on a path. She was a pedestrian in a wilderness that offered no firm footing. As the light began to fail, the realization of her isolation became absolute. She was dressed for a day of high-activity exercise, not for a stationary night in sub-zero temperatures. The temperature dropped toward 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill reached dangerous levels. To continue moving in the dark, through chest-deep snow and dense thickets, would have resulted in a fall or total exhaustion within hours. She stopped near a cluster of balsam firs. The decision to stop is the most difficult choice a survivor can make, as it feels like an admission of defeat. However, for Fig, it was a calculation of energy. She was roughly 2.5 miles from the nearest road, but in these conditions, that distance was impassable. The transition was complete. The journey was no longer about movement, but about the preservation of core body temperature. Survival in the White Mountains during a blizzard is dictated by the laws of thermodynamics. As the wind increased to a sustained roar, Jennifer Fig understood that her primary enemy was convective heat loss. To remain in the open was to invite death by morning. She began the systematic process of creating a microclimate. Using her hands and the remains of her broken ski, she started to excavate a shelter beneath the drooping, snow-heavy branches of a large balsam fir. The choice of location was tactical. The lower branches of the evergreen trees in the Great Gulf often create a natural void or tree well as snow accumulates. Fig expanded this space, digging deep into the packed powder to reach the insulating layer of the earth. She constructed a snow cave, a primitive but effective structure that utilizes the insulating properties of trapped air within the snow crystals. The interior of such a shelter, while cramped and damp, can maintain a temperature near 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the external air temperature drops into the negatives. The construction was a grueling physical task. Every movement in the deep snow required a massive expenditure of calories, a resource she had to manage carefully. She lined the floor of her crawl space with boughs of fir to create a barrier between her body and the frozen ground. Conductive heat loss, the direct transfer of warmth from the body to the cold earth, is often faster than heat loss to the air. By layering the needles and small branches, she created a rudimentary mattress that provided a few inches of separation from the ice. Once the initial structure was complete, Fig established a rigid physical routine. Survival in a confined space is not a passive act. It is a continuous struggle against the slowing of the metabolism. To prevent her muscles from seizing and her core temperature from dropping, she performed isometric exercises. She would flex her toes, tighten her quadriceps, and clench her fists in rhythmic intervals. These small, controlled movements generated enough internal friction to keep her blood circulating to her extremities. The environment inside the cave was one of sensory deprivation. The thick walls of snow muffled the screaming wind outside, replacing it with a heavy, pressurized silence. The only light was the dim, blue filtered glow that managed to penetrate the entrance during the day, and total darkness at night. Fig had to manage the opening of her cave with precision. If it was too large, the wind would strip away the warmth she had generated. If it was too small, CO2 levels could rise or the entrance could be completely sealed by the drifting blizzard, suffocating her. She monitored her breathing and the moisture on her clothing. Wetness is a precursor to freezing. She used her hands to beat the frost from her outer layers and avoided sweating during her exercises, as damp fabric loses its ability to trap heat. This was the beginning of a long-term stasis. She was no longer a marathon runner moving through space. She was a biological engine idling in a cold chamber, stripping away every non-essential thought to focus on the single requirement of maintaining a 98.6-degree core. The cave became her entire world, a white, frozen tomb that she had to keep alive from the inside. By the third day, the initial shock of entrapment had transitioned into a grim, metabolic reality. Jennifer Fig's survival was no longer a matter of willpower alone. It was a matter of chemistry. Her body was a closed system with a finite amount of fuel. She possessed a small supply of food, primarily high-energy snacks like chocolate and nuts that were intended for a single afternoon of exertion. To survive 3 weeks, she had to dismantle the human instinct to eat when hungry and replace it with a clinical, starvation-based rationing system. She divided her meager supplies into portions so small they were symbolic rather than satiating. A single nut or a square of chocolate was not a meal, it was a psychological anchor. She consumed these fragments at specific, timed intervals, using the act of eating to mark the passage of hours that otherwise bled together in the dim light of the snow cave. This discipline served a dual purpose. It extended her caloric runway and provided a sense of agency in an environment where she had no control over the weather or her rescue. Hydration presented a more immediate physiological threat. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Great Gulf, liquid water does not exist. To drink, Fig had to melt snow. Without a stove or a heat source, she was forced to use her own body heat. She would fill a small container with snow and tuck it inside her clothing, against her skin. This was a dangerous trade-off. To melt the snow, her body had to surrender its precious warmth, temporarily lowering her core temperature to create a few ounces of water. She managed this process with the same calculated precision she applied to her rations, sipping just enough to prevent the thick, dark urine and cognitive decline that signal severe dehydration. The biological toll of this deprivation was systematic. As her fat stores were depleted, her body began to catabolize muscle tissue for energy. Her resting heart rate slowed as her metabolism moved into a defensive, low-power state. The cold became a constant, physical weight. It was not a sensation on the skin, but a deep, aching cold that resided in the marrow of her bones. She described the sensation not as shivering, but as a perpetual vibration of the muscles as they tried to generate heat. Despite the physical wasting, Fig maintained a rigorous mental schedule. To prevent the onset of the woods madness, or the lethargy that often precedes death in the wilderness, she engaged in complex mental exercises. She recited poetry, recalled the details of past marathons, and visualized the mechanics of her training. She treated her mind like a muscle that required daily flexing. She spoke aloud to herself, her voice sounding thin and alien in the muffled acoustics of the cave, to confirm her own presence in the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. The discipline extended to her physical environment. She kept the interior of her shelter meticulously organized. Any moisture that accumulated on the ceiling of the cave had to be scraped away before it could drip onto her clothing. The fir boughs that served as her floor had to be rearranged to maintain their loft. This was the work of survival. It was a repetitive, exhausting cycle of melting snow, performing isometrics, and managing the structural integrity of her frozen cell. By the end of the first week, she had settled into a routine that was entirely detached from the world of the living. She was a biological entity performing the bare minimum functions required to persist, waiting for a change in the environment that she could not predict and might not survive to see. As the second week transitioned into the third, the geography of the Great Gulf remained unchanged, but the internal landscape of Jennifer Fig began to fracture. The human mind is not designed for the sustained sensory deprivation of a snow cave. In the absolute darkness of the New Hampshire nights, which lasted nearly 14 hours, the boundaries between wakefulness and sleep dissolved. Time was no longer a linear progression. It became a circular, repetitive loop of cold and shivering. The physical wasting of her body reached a critical threshold. Her hands, calloused from years of training, grew thin and translucent. The lack of significant caloric intake meant that her body was no longer generating enough heat to warm the air around her. The comfort of the 32-degree cave vanished, replaced by a biting chill that seeped through her layers of synthetic clothing. Every movement was now preceded by a long period of mental negotiation. The simple act of reaching for her container of snow felt like an Olympic feat of strength. Psychologically, the silence of the wilderness began to manifest as a physical presence. This is a documented phenomenon in long-term survival. The third man factor, or the auditory hallucinations born from extreme isolation. Fig reported hearing the sounds of voices in the wind, the indistinct chatter of hikers, or the phantom hum of a distant engine. These were not signs of madness, but the brain's desperate attempt to find patterns in the white noise of the blizzard. She had to consciously discard these sounds, anchoring herself in the reality of the fir boughs and the frozen walls of her shelter. The psychological pressure was compounded by the failure of external hope. She knew that search parties would have been dispatched days ago. She also knew the protocols of mountain rescue in the presidential range. After a week of sub-zero temperatures and record-breaking snowfall, a search often transitions from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The mathematical probability of a human surviving in the Great Gulf for 14 days without a heat source or significant food is near zero. Fig was aware of these statistics. She had to live with the knowledge that, to the outside world, she was likely already considered a casualty of the mountain. Her dreams became vivid and centered entirely on warmth and consumption. She dreamt of the specific texture of hot food and the sensation of dry wool. Upon waking to the damp, freezing reality of the cave, the emotional weight was crushing. Apathy, the most dangerous symptom of late-stage hypothermia, began to set in. It would have been easy to stop the isometric exercises, to stop melting the snow, and to simply let the cold finish its work. To combat this, Fig relied on the muscle memory of the athlete. She treated her survival like the final miles of a marathon where the wall had been hit long ago. She did not think about the 21st day. She only thought about the next 60 seconds of breathing. The weather in the presidential range finally broke in the first week of March. The relentless cycle of blizzards subsided, replaced by a high-pressure system that brought a clear, blindingly bright sun and a slight elevation in temperature. For Jennifer Fig, now in her 21st day of isolation, the change in light was a signal. The caloric reserves of her body were exhausted. Her muscles had wasted significantly, and her motor skills were beginning to fail. She understood that if she did not leave the shelter of the Great Gulf now, she would never leave it. On the morning of March 12th, she began the process of extricating herself from the snow cave. The physical exertion required to move through the crust of the snow was monumental. Without her skis, and with her strength diminished by weeks of starvation, she could no longer walk in the traditional sense. She began a slow, agonizing crawl. She used her arms to pull her body forward, post-holing through the drifts that had accumulated over 3 weeks. She followed the natural drainage of the Gulf, moving toward the lower elevations where the forest density changed. Her progress was measured in feet per hour rather than miles. The cognitive fog of late-stage survival made navigation difficult, but the geography of the mountain provided a singular path downward. The rescue was not a dramatic aerial extraction. It was a quiet intersection of paths. Fig eventually reached a maintained trail, the Gulfside Trail, where she was spotted by a group of hikers. To the hikers, she appeared as a ghost, a gaunt, frost-covered figure emerging from a wilderness that had been written off as a graveyard weeks prior. There was no immediate celebration. The hikers, realizing the severity of her condition, provided immediate warmth and alerted New Hampshire Fish and Game. Fig was transported off the mountain by a litter team, her body stabilized but her vitals precarious. She had survived 21 days in the most hostile environment in the eastern United States. The recovery of Jennifer Fig was a clinical process. In the hospital, the focus shifted from the mountain's geography to the interior geography of her body. Doctors treated the severe frostbite on her extremities and the profound metabolic imbalances caused by 3 weeks of starvation. She had lost a significant percentage of her body weight. Her muscles had been cannibalized to keep her heart and brain functioning. Yet, the most striking aspect of her survival was not the physical damage, but the lack of it. She had avoided the catastrophic cognitive decline usually associated with such prolonged exposure. Her story became a case study for search and rescue teams and wilderness medicine experts. It redefined the window of survivability in the White Mountains. The data from her ordeal proved that human endurance, when coupled with rigid psychological discipline and an understanding of thermodynamics, could override the statistical probability of death. She had survived not by fighting the mountain, but by becoming a static part of it, minimizing her presence until the environment allowed her to leave. Today, the Great Gulf Wilderness remains as indifferent as it was in February 1989. The snow caves she dug have long since collapsed and melted into the spring runoff, leaving no physical trace of her 21 days of isolation. There is no monument at the trailhead, only the same granite peaks and the same funneling winds. The significance of the event remains a quiet testament to the capacity of the human system to endure. When the wind rises over the presidential range, it carries the same silence that Fig navigated, a reminder that in the wilderness, survival is not a victory over nature, but a temporary, hard-won truce.